Standing up for press freedom, condemnation grows over the jailing of Al Jazeera journalists in Egypt, adding to the numbers detained around the world for simply doing their job. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Seeker. Egypt's president says he won't interfere with the judicial verdict that sentenced 3 Al Jazeera journalists to lengthy jail terms on Monday. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was speaking as criticism over the Cairo court's decision grew ever louder from journalists and activists, world leaders and diplomats. Mohammed Fahmy, Bahir Mohammed and Peter Grester were jailed for up to 10 years for what the Egyptian government describes as spreading false news and aiding a terrorist organization. Now, in a televised address on Tuesday, President Sisi distanced himself from the verdict.
I called the Minister of Justice and I told him one thing. We will not interfere in judicial matters because the Egyptian judiciary is an independent and exalted judiciary. No one interferes with the affairs of state institutions. No one comments or talks about these state institutions. If we want state institutions, we must respect court rulings and not comment on them, even if others don't understand these rulings.
As we said, the condemnation of the verdict has been almost universal, not least from political leaders around the world. US Secretary of State John Kerry has called the sentences handed down chilling and draconian, while Britain's Prime Minister echoed earlier comments made by his Foreign Minister, saying he was completely appalled by the verdicts. David Drake, Canada's ambassador to Egypt, said he was very disappointed and that Canada doesn't understand this particular verdict. While Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said her country could not understand the verdict based on the evidence that was presented in the case. Now, the Australian Foreign Minister's comments were balanced by those of Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who spoke on Tuesday about a measured approach to dealing with Egypt.
Well, what we don't want to do is engage in unhelpful megaphone diplomacy, because that won't do Peter Grester any good. It won't do his 2 Al Jazeera colleagues any good. What we want to do is to talk calmly and patiently and reasonably to the Egyptian government. We want what's best for the long-term interests of Egypt, as well as what's best for Peter Grester and his colleagues.
Seeking what's best for now and for all journalists going about their daily business. Let's get the thoughts of our guests on this very sensitive issue. In London, Amnesty International Director Steve Crawshaw, and joining us via Skype from London is Alex Thompson, Chief Correspondent for Channel 4 News. Good to have you both with us. Alex, if I could start with you. I want to start as well with the comments from Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, saying that he is not going to, in his words, interfere with the rulings of the judiciary. Now, on the face of it, that would appear to close the door on any possibility of the president intervening and reversing this decision to release our colleagues. But that is no cause for discouragement, is it? I mean, the campaign that is going on social media and throughout the world will continue regardless. How important is that?
Well, it's important that it continues to keep these people's plight in the public mind, and I'm certainly going to continue carrying around my little black roll of gaffer tape, and I hope I don't have to get a new roll of gaffer tape to make that point and stick it across my mouth every opportunity I get. But I commend to you the words we just heard of the Australian Prime Minister. Megaphone diplomacy is not going to help these 3 guys. It's not going to help Al Jazeera. It's not going to help Egypt. So I think there's a lot to be said for avoiding the temptation to make sort of wider comment in that regard and let the quieter and perhaps more effective channels behind the scenes, with, I suspect, the elapse of time, and I think it will take perhaps a month or 2, to keep those channels open, keep those channels of communication going, and see what diplomacy can bring behind the scenes here.
I got to ask you as well, do you think, how much of this was for domestic consumption on the part of Sisi? The idea that he doesn't want to appear to be, at least right now, backing down from this condemnation from outside?
The government had to make a strong decision, and the government of Sisi at the moment is in the business of making a lot of strong decisions. Look at the recent the decisions from the courts over the recent death sentences at the weekend. They are out to smash the opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, as they see it. And Al Jazeera has become, I suspect, tarred with that brush, not because of any editorial policy at all, not because these journalists were not doing a good, objective job, they plainly were, but simply because, obviously, Al Jazeera is funded by the government in Qatar, and the government of Qatar funds very openly, a number of opposition groups across the region. That's the wider framework, but that is not how we untangle, I suspect, something like this. That is for diplomatic, quiet back channels.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit more about that point about the geopolitical game that's being played here, Alex. And Al Jazeera network has been portrayed in Egypt as an enemy of the state due to the perception, as you say, that it's a mouthpiece of the Muslim Brotherhood. But we should point out, of course, that Al Jazeera English is a separate channel with a separate editorial staff. But that is a distinction that has been very hard to get across inside Egypt. How much of an obstacle is that, do you think, going forward?
On the streets, I think it's a huge obstacle. I think it's probably almost an insurmountable obstacle at street level. But at street level, in the era of public opinion, that is not where this is going to be sorted out. As I say, it's going to be sorted out in quieter ways, quieter back channel. There is an appeals process. Whether that is something that Al Jazeera chooses to get engaged with is obviously going to be a matter for Al Jazeera, not for me or any others to comment on. But the problem is, exactly as you've outlined, I think it's very difficult at popular level, once the government has gone down this route, to sell the idea that Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera are in some way generally, if you like, editorially in the pockets of the Qatari government. Whether that's true or untrue, it doesn't matter. That is what is being put out on the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and beyond. That's going to be hard to get around. But get around it, it must be, and get around it has to be. And the way that that will be done is absolutely through diplomatic channels. And the government will find a way, and a way must be found down the line to get everybody off the hook with everybody's face intact.
Steve Crawshaw, obviously your organisation, Amnesty International, has been very active in highlighting not only this case but several other cases inside Egypt of journalists being rounded up and arrested, because it's not just our colleagues that have been detained. It's a number of other journalists. Do you worry perhaps that the focus on Al Jazeera it takes away from the plight of many other journalists operating in Egypt?
I certainly hope it doesn't take away, and I don't think one should think of it as an either or. I mean, in many respects, the appalling nature of what we saw with the judgment yesterday, and as Alex Thompson and you have rightly described, that having a huge impact around the world in that sense, that I hope gives us an opportunity to remind everybody, including governments which have been to some extent too silent on many of these issues, that this is not just about the small number of Al Jazeera journalists that are here involved, but also it clearly involves them most dramatically in the headlines at the moment, but also a number of other journalists. And it's not just journalists, of course, it's freedom of expression, freedom of assembly more generally. And I think that's where governments need to understand that if we want that healthy, stable Egypt moving forward, the direction we've been going, leaving aside for a moment the Al Jazeera issue, has not been good at all. And we need to remember this is not just about one particular. We're seeing it in its very grave form with the current administration, but to be honest, successive ones since the fall of Mubarak. There was that time of great hope in spring 2011 of finally an end to those 30 years of repression, and actually we've seen a whole series of violations since then, and what seems to be getting worse. I certainly agree with what's been said, is that it'll be a slow path probably to get change now, but I think that the sense of governments around the world understanding why this matters, and therefore by extension within Egypt as well, I think that will certainly be very important.
Yeah, do you think this decision, Steve Crawshaw, has kind of reached a crescendo now, that things there's a perception that Egypt has gone too far with this now, and that it may have ended up sort of stabbing itself in, sort of shooting itself in the foot rather, and that
Sure.
perhaps this is what is needed to get the attention back on what's happening inside the country?
It's very difficult to predict exactly, but certainly from Amnesty International perspective, we've done a whole series of reports in the last couple of years about very, very grave violations on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, women's rights, a whole different range of issues which we really thought should be going in a better direction and actually have not been. And we have seen that, what I think of as a rather old-fashioned government attitude of let's not look there because it's good to have them as a friendly government so we won't criticise, which of course was much of the problem throughout the Mubarak era of not wishing to criticise Mubarak. And I do think that potentially what we've seen this week has perhaps changed that calculation somehow, that even though it goes together with quiet diplomacy, which is absolutely appropriate and quite right, but that's
as opposed to the megaphone diplomacy that was referred to, that we talked about earlier.
Correct, but crucially, sometimes quiet diplomacy is used as a kind of synonym or as a euphemism, frankly not pressing the point at all, which I'm sure was certainly not what was intended when that phrase was used. But that's what we need to say, is that strong pressure. And even now, until now at least, we have seen these kind of quite mixed messages. So, for example, John Kerry there at the weekend, on the one hand, seemed to be sending some strong messages about the importance of rights for all, and that's absolutely right. That's the real issue. It is rights for all. You don't pick and choose which group you're ready to be generous or not generous to. But on the other hand, there was also the unlocking of $500 million of military aid at the same time, where I think that we need to see a very strong signal from around the world. It can't just come from one part of the world. It needs to be from around the world saying this is not the right way to behave for all Egyptians. And again, I would re-emphasize clearly, it's quite right that Al Jazeera is focusing on these particular cases, and indeed we are all focusing on these cases, but this is part of a much, much wider pattern, and that's what really needs to be addressed.
Yeah, how important is that point to Alex Thompson, that this is part of a wider pattern, that this isn't just about 3 journalists sitting in a jail cell in Cairo?
Oh, absolutely, it's part of a wider pattern. We regard this as certainly of an occupational hazard, and anyone who's been on the road for any considerable period of time is going to wind up on the inside of a prison cell in one shape or form or another, I'm sure. Certainly my experience and that of my colleagues. This will likely give some regimes around the world, particularly those with a heavy military influence, as we see in Egypt, license and a green light to go ahead with this. And I think what's worrying too in the wider frame, just to pick up on what Steve was saying a moment ago, is that this happens when the American administration, well placed to put pressure on regimes for precisely this kind of thing, is absolutely woefully wrong-footed. As was pointed out yesterday or the day before, John Kerry is giving more than $500 million worth of military aid plus 10 Apache helicopters to the Egyptians. The next day he says, and mark this, he says this is a chilling decision, this verdict, particularly at this point in Egypt's transition. You've got to ask yourself, what kind of transition does the United States think Egypt is engaged in? Transition to what? He almost seems to be suggesting this was some kind of transition to democracy. I'm sure Steve would join me and many others in observing that what we're seeing on the streets of Cairo is anything but a transition in that direction.
Well, part of the condemnation of this verdict from groups like Steve's organisation, Amnesty International, is based on the evidence, or lack of it, that was presented in the court. And Kamal Santamaria is going to take a look now at the case that was put forward by the prosecution.
We've shouted as long as and loud as we possibly can for the freedom of our staff, and one of the reasons for that is the complete absurdity of the claims and evidence brought against them. We felt it was important to show you again exactly what was revealed in that Cairo court and what it doesn't tell you about our journalism. Go back to April 10 when the prosecution presented its first evidence. Now, it claimed the work of Mohammed Fahy, Bahr Mohammed and Peter Grester had smeared Egypt's reputation. They'd apparently doctored footage and helped terrorists. But the only 3 videos shown had nothing to do with Al Jazeera. There was this, for example, a documentary about Somali bandits. It was made by Peter Grester in 2011 when he worked at the BBC. There was a news report about horse welfare in Egypt. That was by Sky News Arabia. And footage from a press conference in Nairobi was shown too, with absolutely no context. Also with no context, we had these images you'll see here from Peter Grester's laptop. Those are of his parents on holiday in Germany and in Latvia. Finally, though, on May 22, some actual Al Jazeera footage was shown. There were routine news interviews with politicians from the Muslim Brotherhood, a group which is, of course, now banned. But the court was also shown Greste's other reports about sheep herding and football. And finally, this. It's a pop video by the Belgian-Australian singer-songwriter Gautier, presented to the court. Just what this is meant to prove, well, who knows? But it all backs up what the likes of Amnesty International have said, that throughout the hearings there was simply no credible evidence on hand. Unfortunately, it's that very evidence which has left our three colleagues behind bars, and the world asking, for what? So
Kamal Santamaria there, just explaining to us the evidence that was presented during the trial. And it begs the question, Steve Crawshaw, as to whether this whole thing was a stitch-up from the beginning, considering how irrelevant all of the evidence was that was presented in the trial.
Well, certainly Amnesty International, which was following the trial closely, found no shred of credible evidence that was presented. And we saw that there was if you like, a pre-decided outcome, to be very blunt on these things. What now remains an open question, and I do absolutely believe it is still an open question, is whether we can still create the change, the pressure necessary generated through those both private and public conversations to make sure that this is not an end, this is just a stage on the way to a different outcome, which we will achieve in due course, I hope.
It begs this question as well, doesn't it, as to how independent the judiciary is in Egypt. If you go again on the so-called evidence that was presented during those trial proceedings, and then we get this verdict which was roundly condemned.
Yes, I mean, there was a faint irony that we had the president saying that he couldn't possibly get involved in this because the exalted judiciary has such independence. Well, in fact, we're seeing that this is clearly not the case. To take one issue which we haven't addressed today, but gives you an idea in terms of the judiciary, we've had so many people have been killed in the last year or two with the protests on the streets, and yet people completely not being held to account. So more than 1,000 deaths there, and there are basically no serious prosecutions happening of police and security forces for all of those deaths. And then on the other hand, we have the contrast of here we have people who have merely been doing their jobs as journalists and get 7 or 10 years in jail. So the contrast there is very, very stark. I think it's a very obvious contrast, and I think it's one that should give pause to all governments in their conversations with the Egyptian government, that this is not a way forward, both in terms of this trial, but also in terms of the absolute lack of accountability on the very, very serious violations that we're seeing in so many other contexts across the country.
So as far as the legal options here, then where do things go from here? If the Egyptian president has already said that he's not going to interfere in this, what options remain then in terms of getting these 3 journalists released? Is it the appeals process? Is it further efforts to try and gain a pardon? Where does it go?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say exactly where it goes in terms of the formal process, because above all, this has been, it must be said, a political decision. I mean, that can be seen right the way through, and your description of the trial, which I say is matched by Amnesty International's own observation of the trial, it shows that this politics is right at the heart of it. So just as politics has created the complications, created the violations of justice that we have seen, so politics is also able, if it wishes to do so, to unpick and to unlock. And that is what I think absolutely should happen. It should happen for the justice for the individuals concerned, and it should happen for justice for Egypt more generally, and in order to enable the country to move forward. That's what you need. In order to have the decent fundamental stability for a country, you have to have a kind of justice you can believe in. And sadly, it was absolutely not the case for 30 years under President Mubarak. Everyone knew that justice did not exist. There were then the hopes that this could be a time of real justice that came, and that's not what we're seeing today. So that's the fundamental change that needs to be seen. Exactly how that happens, there will be different ways of doing that, but there certainly are still ways of unlocking if the politicians are persuaded that actually that is the way to go forward, that is the only way to go forward.
All right, well, we'll look at what comes next in a moment. First, journalists around the world, as we've been saying, have held a silent protest to mark the convictions. Barnaby Phillips has more from London.
At the headquarters of one of the world's most famous broadcasters, an uncharacteristic moment of silence and solidarity with the Al Jazeera team in Egypt.
The Egyptian authorities are not just robbing 3 innocent men of their freedom, they are intimidating journalists and inhibiting free speech.
The BBC and other British news organisations are sending a letter to the Egyptian president asking him to intervene. Many BBC journalists protested because they know and respect Peter Grester, who worked for this organisation for years. But the BBC believes that there is a wider principle at stake, that the verdict in that Cairo courtroom was an attack on the freedom of the press. This was how the news bulletin ended on Channel 4, a leading independent station in the UK. And this is how Al Jazeera journalists mark this day in our bureaus around the world. In Baghdad, in Peter Grester's base Nairobi, and in our Doha headquarters. But how much impact will all this have in Egypt, where state-controlled media says foreigners should not interfere with their country's legal process?
There is a crackdown on freedom of expression in the country that is being cheered on by large swathes of the public. That is the most dangerous thing, because the authorities feel that they can get away with it because they have a fair degree of popular backing for this. And that's what marks it out against Mubarak, is that at least Mubarak's policies against freedom of expression were widely reviled. These policies now are the same, but they have popular backing, and that is the most worrying thing.
Al Jazeera and other journalists will carry on protesting. International condemnation is likely to grow, but so far there is no sign that the Egyptian authorities are prepared to back down. Barnaby Phillips, Al Jazeera.
So just a sample there of the overwhelming reaction that we have been getting on this decision from journalists around the world. And it is certainly very heartening. And I want to try to end this on a positive note, Steve Crawshaw, just in the couple of minutes that we've got left. Are you confident that our colleagues will eventually be released at some point?
I don't feel able to make predictions as such, but what I would say is that cases which seemed absolutely hopeless had a positive outcome, and people who said you're crazy to even think it's worth campaigning on this issue. Repeatedly people said to Amnesty International, you're living in a kind of dream world if you think that this case can be changed or that case. It won't. And then in due course it was, and the people were, of course, who were released were, of course, grateful both to Amnesty International, more broadly the human rights community, and all those who care. So I think that we should certainly believe that there is the possibility of change. There's no question of that. We've seen it many, many times around the world, and I certainly very much hope it will be the case with these cases also.
And have you seen precedents for this, specifically in Egypt?
Specifically in Egypt, I can't immediately think, but I mean, if you were to ask me around the world, then yes, of course, absolutely. I mean, from Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, in Myanmar, to a whole range of prisoners of conscience. The Amnesty International phrase, which was created at the time of Amnesty's creation more than 50 years ago, prisoners of conscience, and that's how we as an organisation have defined these 3 cases as well. We've certainly seen that again and again and again, including in the most intransigent places. Eventually, governments understand that their intransigent is not doing them any good, that actually they need to show a bit more flexibility, they need to show a little bit of justice, and that's when we get the positive outcome. So I'm certainly hoping for that.
Steve Crawshaw, thanks very much for talking to us on Inside Story. And our thanks as well to Alex Thompson, who joined us earlier. And as ever, we welcome your thoughts on this issue. You can just leave us your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or why not tweet us? Go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Hazem Seeker. I'll leave you with more from the ongoing campaign seeking the release of our journalists. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
He's not a criminal.